On the ground! Face down now! The white cop roared, baton in hand, as he stormed toward the black woman in the grocery store parking lot. I'm pregnant, she said firmly, cradling her stomach. I'm not a threat. Shut your mouth, he snapped, closing the distance. You people are all the same. Think you're above the law. She stood her ground, her eyes steady. I'm not resisting, officer, but you're crossing a line. Don't tell me how to do my job, you punk. His face flushed red as he threw a punch at her, shoving her backward. She stumbled, but didn't fall. You've made a mistake, she said, her voice calm but cutting. Yeah? And what are you going to do about it? He sneered, raising his baton. She reached into her coat, pulling out her badge. Chief of Police Harris, she said coolly. And you're fired. The cop froze, his baton trembling midair. Wait, what? As we begin this story, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support and spread awareness. The city hummed with life on a crisp morning. Cars honked as they maneuvered through congested lanes, their drivers gripping steering wheels with varying degrees of patience. Pedestrians filled the sidewalks, a stream of hurried steps and murmured conversations. Street vendors called out to passers-by, their voices blending with the rhythm of distant construction. Angela Rivers walked with purpose, her steps confident, yet measured. Her round belly announced her pregnancy proudly, a symbol of the life she carried within. Dressed in a neat blazer over a loose blouse, paired with comfortable flats, she exuded a blend of professionalism and practicality. She carried a small messenger bag slung over her shoulder, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Her gaze swept the street, alert but calm. The city was loud, busy, alive, just as she liked it. She adjusted her pace slightly, mindful of the bustling crowd around her. Across the street, Officer Blake Morrison leaned against the hood of his patrol car, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His hand rested on his hip, just above the holster of his firearm. Blake was in his mid-40s, his face lined with years of street patrol. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming in the sunlight. He squinted, narrowing his gaze on Angela as she crossed the intersection. Something about her confidence, her poise, caught his attention. To him, it felt misplaced, even suspicious. His lips pressed into a thin line, the corners twitching as he muttered something under his breath. Angela, unaware of the scrutiny, continued on her way, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But Blake's eyes stayed on her, his suspicion rising. The pedestrian signal flashed, and Angela stepped off the curb with the rest of the crowd. Her pace was steady, her eyes focused on the path ahead. The city moved with her, an organized chaos she navigated with ease. Officer Blake Morrison's gaze locked on her. Something about the way she moved, her air of confidence, irritated him. He noticed her starting to cross and decided she wasn't following the rules. He pushed off his patrol car and strode toward the intersection, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. "Ma'am," he barked as he reached her. Angela stopped mid-step, startled by the tone. She turned to see the officer approaching, his face hard and unyielding. "Yes?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "You just crossed against the signal," Blake said, pointing to the light that now glowed red for pedestrians. Angela frowned slightly. "No, sir. The signal was green when I crossed. I was with the crowd." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Don't argue with me. I saw you. You broke the law." Angela took a breath, keeping her tone even. "Officer, I understand your concern, but I assure you I didn't violate any traffic rules. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Her attempt at de-escalation only seemed to fuel his frustration. Blake stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. You think you can talk your way out of this? Angela stayed calm, her voice steady despite her rising nerves. I'm not trying to argue, officer. I just want to clarify. Enough, Blake snapped, his voice cutting her off. People around them began to slow, glancing at the unfolding scene. Angela met his glare, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. The air between them grew heavy, tension building with every passing second. A few passers-by began to slow, their curiosity piqued by the raised voices. Blake's tone had grown sharper, his words cutting through the hum of the city. Angela stood her ground, her calm demeanor contrasting with the officer's escalating hostility. Ma'am, I am going to have to arrest you, Blake growled, his hand now resting firmly on his belt. His voice carried, drawing more attention from the growing crowd. Arrest me? I didn't do anything wrong, Angela replied, her voice steady despite the tension. I've explained myself. I did nothing wrong. The onlookers murmured, a few pulling out their phones to record. The situation was spiraling. Blake's face flushed with anger, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. You monkeys always think you're above the rules, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. I'm done with your attitude. Angela stiffened, her calm mask slipping for a moment. Excuse me? You need to... Blake didn't let her finish. In a sudden, unprovoked burst of rage, he swung his fist, punching Angela squarely in the face. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by shouts of protest. Phones were raised higher, capturing every moment. Angela stumbled back, falling to the pavement. For a moment she stayed there, one hand cradling her cheek. Then, slowly, she got up. Her legs trembled, but her posture remained upright. Her eyes met Blake's, filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the crowd momentarily. Blake faltered, the reality of his actions beginning to sink in as the crowd's shouts grew louder. What's wrong with you? Someone yelled. You hit a pregnant woman. Angela didn't wait for his response. She turned to the crowd, holding her head high as the cameras continued to roll. The sound of sirens cut through the rising noise of the crowd. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions stern but detached. The gathering of witnesses parted slightly, allowing the officers to approach the scene. Angela stood firm, her hand resting on her bruised cheek, her other arm protectively cradling her stomach. Her breathing was steady, though her eyes blazed with quiet determination. Ma'am, are you injured? One of the people in the crowd asked, his tone curt but neutral. I'm fine, Angela said firmly. I don't need any assistance. Blake stepped forward before she could continue. She's refusing to cooperate, he said, his voice hard and authoritative. She crossed against the light, caused a scene, and now she's resisting a lawful investigation. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line, but she kept her composure. That's not true, she said, her voice cutting through the officer's words. This man assaulted me, unprovoked. He called me a monkey. He stopped me, just me alone out of the many people who crossed. He singled me out, a woman of color. I have witnesses and video evidence. The officers who had just arrived exchanged skeptical glances. One of them glanced at the crowd, still recording. Ma'am, let's not exaggerate. Officer Morrison says you were acting suspiciously. Let's keep this civil. Angela straightened, her chin high. I am keeping it civil. He punched me in front of all these people. Blake smirked slightly, his confidence returning. She's trying to turn this around. The officers hesitated, but ultimately nodded. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us for questioning, one of them said, gesturing toward their car. Angela didn't resist. I'll go, she said calmly, locking eyes with Blake. But you're making a mistake. Blake grabbed her arm and led her to the car, his grip unnecessarily tight. As the door closed behind her, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The storm Angela had warned about was already gathering momentum. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories when they drop. Inside the station, the air was heavy with the hum of activity. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and officers moved with a mix of urgency and indifference. Angela sat on a cold metal chair near the processing desk, her posture relaxed despite the tension surrounding her. Her cheek still bore the faint redness from Blake's punch, but she didn't flinch. Blake stood at the counter, filling out paperwork with exaggerated precision. He glanced at Angela occasionally, his smirk returning each time he caught her calm expression. Other officers moved in and out, some casting casual, dismissive glances her way. Conversations were laced with offhand remarks and chuckles, clearly assuming Angela was just another troublemaker. Do you think Angela is handling herself well so far? If you were in her shoes, how would you handle the situation? Let us know in the comments. Angela quietly observed. She noted the sarcastic comments, the careless handling of evidence, and the camaraderie of complacency among the officers. Every detail was etched into her memory, her mind sharp despite her outward serenity. Lieutenant Sarah Lawson entered the room, her presence commanding but not overbearing. She was in her early 40s, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Her auburn hair was tied neatly, and her uniform was immaculate. She paused when she saw Angela, her gaze lingering. Lawson walked over, her boots clicking softly on the tiled floor. She stood by Angela, her tone softer than the others. You're awfully calm for someone in your situation, she said, tilting her head slightly. Angela looked up and met Lawson's eyes, her expression unreadable. There's no need to panic, she replied with a faint smile. Things always have a way of sorting themselves out. Lawson narrowed her eyes, sensing something beneath the surface. You seem like someone who knows more than they let on. Angela's smile widened slightly. Maybe. Or maybe I've just seen enough to know when to wait. Angela sat in the stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the plain walls. The air was still, save for the faint buzz of a nearby camera. She sat calmly at the metal table, her hands resting in front of her, her demeanor unshaken. Blake entered with a clipboard in hand, his posture radiating false confidence. He closed the door behind him with a deliberate thud, eyeing Angela with thinly veiled disdain. I am really sick and tired of seeing your face around here, he said, dropping the clipboard onto the table. Angela looked up at him, her expression neutral. I'd like to make a phone call, please. Blake scoffed. That's not going to happen. Angela leaned back slightly in her chair, her calm gaze never wavering. Isn't a phone call a standard right for someone in custody? She asked, her voice soft but firm. Blake bristled. You're not under arrest. Drop your statement and we will take it from there. Then I'm free to leave? Angela replied smoothly, tilting her head. Blake's jaw tightened. You're here for a reason. Let's focus on that. Angela allowed a small smile to creep onto her lips. Of course. Speaking of making a statement, Do you usually process complaints against officers this way? No forms, no impartial witnesses? Blake frowned. We're handling this the way we handle things. Stop speaking. When I ask you to speak, then you'll speak. Interesting, Angela said, her tone casual. And when do you notify internal affairs about incidents like this? Blake's eyes narrowed. That's none of your concern. Angela leaned forward slightly. It is if proper procedures aren't being followed. I'd hate for anyone to think this department lacks professionalism. Blake's face turned red as he stammered, caught off guard by her pointed questions. Angela's calm demeanor remained unshaken, the balance of power subtly shifting with every word she spoke. As Blake paced the small interrogation room, spouting questions laced with irritation, Angela sat quietly, her composure unshaken. Then, a faint buzz came from her bag. Blake froze, his brow furrowing. What was that? He snapped. Angela calmly reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. Before Blake could react, she answered it, her tone steady. Yes, I'll be there soon, she said, her voice carrying an air of quiet authority. She ended the call and placed the phone back in her bag without a hint of urgency. Blake's face turned crimson. You had your phone this whole time? That's against protocol. Angela raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Maybe you should check your procedures again. You never asked for it. Before Blake could respond, the door swung open. A man in an impeccable suit stepped in, his presence instantly commanding the room. He was tall, his badge identifying him as a senior official from City Hall. The room fell silent as Blake and the other officers stared, dumbfounded. Angela, the man said warmly, offering her a polite nod. I apologize for the delay. I'm here to ensure everything is sorted out. Angela stood, her posture poised and professional. Thank you for coming, Mr. Carter, she replied with a faint smile. Carter turned to Blake, his tone shifting to ice. Officer Morrison, release her immediately. Your actions today have been reported, and this incident will be reviewed thoroughly. Blake stammered, his confidence shattered. Carter ignored him, placing a thick file on the desk. This contains everything you need to know about Ms. Rivers, and why this department will be answering for its actions. Angela gave Blake a final knowing glance as she walked out with Carter, leaving the officers stunned and the power dynamics irreversibly shifted. Blake sat at his desk, his fingers drumming anxiously on the keyboard. The office buzzed around him, but his focus was solely on Angela Rivers. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She was too calm, too prepared, and the way that City Hall official had addressed her, it gnawed at him. He typed her name into the system, but the search yielded surprisingly little. Angela Rivers, age 38. No criminal record. A few professional credentials tied to community organizations and consulting firms. Her background seemed clean, almost too clean, as if carefully curated. No loose threads, no glaring details he could latch onto. Blake leaned back in his chair, frustration building. He scrolled through public records, but every lead hit a dead end. Who was she? And why did she have such high-powered connections? Hey, Morrison, one of the other officers called from across the room. You really think it's a good idea to push this? That guy from City Hall looked serious. Blake shot him a glare. Stay out of it. I am doing my job. Another officer chimed in, her tone cautious. Feels like this is bigger than you think. Maybe we're in over our heads. Blake slammed his fist on the desk, silencing them. She's hiding something. I'll prove it. But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. His investigation was going nowhere, and his colleague's unease only deepened his paranoia. He glanced back at the file Carter had left, still unopened on the captain's desk. Its presence loomed like a silent accusation. Blake's suspicion grew, but so did his unease. For the first time, he began to wonder if he was the one who had underestimated the situation. And Angela Rivers. Angela stood at the station's exit, calm and composed as always. Blake loomed nearby, his arms crossed, still trying to maintain control of the situation. She glanced at him before walking out and said, "I'll see you all tomorrow." Blake scoffed, waving her off. "Yeah, sure. Whatever you say." The next morning, the station buzzed with nervous energy. A mandatory meeting had been announced, and every officer was required to attend. Whispers filled the room as the staff speculated on what was happening. Blake leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, feigning indifference, though his mind raced. The room fell silent as the door opened. Angela Rivers walked in, but this time, she wasn't the composed civilian from the day before. She wore a pristine chief of police uniform, the badge on her chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Gasps rippled through the room as realization set in. Angela strode to the front of the room with unwavering confidence. She stood tall, scanning the faces of the officers, many of whom now wore expressions of shock and disbelief. Her gaze finally settled on Blake, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Good morning, everyone," Angela began, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Chief Angela Rivers. As of today, I will be leading this department." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Blake's face turned pale, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at her. Angela let the silence linger for a moment before adding, "We'll address yesterday's situation shortly." Her gaze bore into Blake's, and for the first time, he felt truly exposed. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and it was clear that Angela Rivers was now firmly in control. Chief Angela Rivers stood at the podium in the station's main conference room, her presence commanding the attention of every officer in the room. The atmosphere was heavy, tension thick among the ranks. Officers sat quietly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to guarded curiosity. Angela's voice was steady as she addressed them. "This department has a history, some of it honorable, but much of it deeply troubling. Let me be clear, those days are over." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. She scanned the room, her sharp gaze lingering on Blake for a moment before continuing. "Effective immediately, I am launching a department-wide investigation into misconduct. Every complaint, every case of abuse, every failure to uphold the law with integrity will be reviewed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Angela silenced them with a raised hand. "This is not a punishment for those who have served honorably. It is a reckoning for those who have used their positions to harm, intimidate, or undermine the trust of the community." She paused, letting her words sink in. Yesterday's incident is a prime example of behavior that will no longer be tolerated. Officer Morrison's actions, and the inaction of those who witnessed it, will be reviewed thoroughly. Racism, abuse of power, and complacency have no place here. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed. His colleagues cast sideways glances, their confidence in him visibly shaken. Angela leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but calm. "If you can't rise to the standards of accountability and justice, I suggest you turn in your badge now. For those willing to change, you'll find a leader who believes in fairness and redemption." The room remained silent as Angela's gaze swept over them, signaling the dawn of a new era. In the quiet confines of her office, Angela sat behind her desk, her posture composed and unyielding. Blake stood opposite her, his usual confidence diminished. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing the tension between them. Angela gestured to the chair in front of her. "Sit," she said, her tone calm but firm. Blake hesitated, then dropped into the chair, his hands gripping the armrests. Angela opened a folder on her desk, revealing photographs, written statements, and stills from security footage. She slid one of the photos toward him, an image of him striking Angela in the street. "This is you," Angela said, her voice even. "And this is the behavior that has brought us here." Blake stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "She—" Angela raised a hand, cutting him off. "Spare me the excuses, Morrison. Witnesses, video evidence, and your own words tell a very different story." Blake's face flushed as she continued, her words precise and measured. "You escalated a routine situation into an unnecessary confrontation. You struck an unarmed pregnant woman in full view of the public. Your actions were not only unprofessional, they were a gross abuse of power." Blake's hands tightened on the armrests. "I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice cracking. "If I had—" "That's the point," Angela interrupted, leaning forward. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Your duty is to serve and protect everyone, not to act on prejudice or ego." Blake's shoulders slumped, his earlier bravado shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. Angela's voice softened, but remained firm. "You've failed the badge, Blake. There will be consequences. The question now is whether you're willing to face them with any integrity." Blake sat in silence, his downfall complete. Angela sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on Blake as he fumbled for words. She allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle before speaking again. "You know," she began, her voice calm, but laced with steel. "My appointment as chief wasn't just a promotion. It was part of a larger plan." Blake frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Angela leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "I've been monitoring this department for weeks. My appointment was kept quiet so I could observe the culture here firsthand. And what I found was exactly what I expected. Systemic issues rooted in abuse of power, bias, and negligence." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's not fair. Most of us do our jobs." Angela cut him off with a raised hand. "You may think that, but the patterns don't lie. Your actions yesterday weren't an isolated incident. They were a symptom of a much deeper problem." Her voice softened slightly as she continued. "I've been where many people in this community are, on the receiving end of unchecked authority. When I was younger, I was stopped and humiliated by an officer who saw my skin color as a threat. That moment shaped me, but it didn't break me. It made me determined to change things." Blake's eyes widened as her words sank in, his earlier defensiveness fading. Angela leaned back, her gaze unwavering. "I know what it feels like to be powerless in the face of injustice. That's why I'm here. This department will change, whether you're part of that change or not." Blake sat in stunned silence, her words cutting through any remaining defiance. For the first time, he truly understood who he was dealing with, and what she stood for. The press conference was held on the steps of the police department, the morning sun casting a sharp light on the gathered crowd. Reporters, community members, and activists filled the area, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. Cameras flashed as Chief Angela Rivers stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding and calm. She looked out at the crowd, her face serious but composed. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "I stand before you today to address an incident that has rightfully drawn significant attention. Yesterday, a member of this department violated the trust placed in them by this community." Angela paused, letting her words sink in. "This behavior is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of this department or the standards we are working to uphold. Accountability is not optional. It is the foundation of justice." She continued, her tone firm. Officer Blake Morrison's actions were not only unprofessional, but unlawful. Effective immediately, he has been terminated from his position and is facing charges for his conduct. Let me be clear. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping in support. Angela's expression softened slightly as she added, "This incident highlights a broader issue within law enforcement, a need for systemic change. Under my leadership, this department will commit to transparency, integrity, and rebuilding the trust of the community we serve." Reporters shouted questions, but Angela remained poised, concluding with a firm, "Thank you." "Do you think Officer Blake got what he deserved? Or do you think he should have gotten a second chance?" To show your support and solidarity for Angela, hit the subscribe button right away. As the press conference aired nationally, support for Angela poured in from across the country. Meanwhile, Blake's name trended on every major platform, his misconduct becoming a symbol of what needed to change in policing. For Angela, it was the first step in a long road toward justice and redemption. Blake sat at his desk for the last time, the weight of his actions and their consequences pressing down on him. His belongings were packed into a plain cardboard box, photos, a coffee mug, and a few personal trinkets. The room felt colder now, stripped of the authority he once wielded. As he reached for the last file in his drawer, he noticed an envelope sitting on the desk. It hadn't been there before. The envelope was unmarked except for his name written in bold, precise letters. Frowning, he opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a formal letter, stamped with the insignia of an official investigation. The text was brief, but direct. "You are formally invited to testify in an inquiry into corruption and misconduct within the department. Non-compliance will result in legal action. Chief Angela Rivers, lead investigator." Blake's hands trembled as he read the letter again. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had thought his termination was the end of it, but now it seemed Angela wasn't finished with him, or the department. Meanwhile, Angela sat in her office, the city's skyline visible through the window behind her. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of a desk fan. On her desk was a framed photo of her family, a reminder of why she had fought so hard to be where she was now. She picked up the photo and smiled faintly, her expression one of determination. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, setting the frame back in its place. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the storm Angela was about to unleash, a fight for justice that was far from over. This story is a stark reminder of the ugly reality of racism and racial profiling. It's a painful example of how some people are judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin. Treating someone with dignity and respect shouldn't depend on their title or status. It's the bare minimum we owe each other as human beings. No one should have to pull out a badge to be treated like they matter. If this video made you reflect, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Let's spark the conversations that lead to change. And if you believe in calling out injustice and amplifying stories that matter, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Together, we can shine a light on the truth and work toward a better world. Let's keep the conversation going.